Welcome to the Productivity Show podcast, where we believe that you can get the important things done without having to sacrifice your health, family, and things that matter to you. My name is Han. I'm the founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life. And today I'm joined by a very special guest. His name is Dr. Andrew Hill. He's the founder of the Peak Brain Institute. He holds a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA's Department of Psychology and continues to do research on attention and cognition. And he also has a podcast called the Head First Podcast with Dr. Hill. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be back.
Yeah, we had you on 4 or 5 years ago. So a lot of things have changed, obviously.
That's right. In the before times. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's also around the time when you started your company. One of the things that has changed on the podcast as well is we introduce our guests' top 3 favorite resources. So I would love to ask you, what are some of the favorite things you've recently consumed or purchased that you would like to share with the audience?
I would say in terms of like things that I rely on to structure and keep me engaged and productive, I spend a fair amount of time tracking metabolic features on an app called Chronometer. It's one of these macro like MyFitnessPal, et cetera. Something in that neighborhood I find super useful because humans are really bad at estimating like how many calories or what amount of fat or that kind of stuff. Just as an educational tool to check. I do a lot of metabolic biohacking to support the brain. And one of the tools that I use a lot is that one called Chronometer. I also tend to do a lot of similar reasons, use a tool, a little piece of hardware called Sense, which I actually have within reach. So BioSense is a little ketone meter for the breath. And since it's the breath, not the blood, it's easier to measure a lot. And B, it's getting downstream measurements, not the effect of what you just ate, but it's more about the effect of all the lifestyle factors that will shift your body in and out of metabolic modes. So I use it as this indirect downstream measurement of several days of behavior, if you will, trending in the right direction. And then I really rely on other biohacking devices like an Oura Ring and things. And I tend to integrate all that information back into Chronometer. So Chronometer aggregates not just my diet and stuff, and as I make notes of exercise, but my sleep information gets pulled in and my acetone from my breath from the BioSense gets pulled in. So I end up with a nice little dashboard there. So I guess that's really a 3 for 1, depending how you count. So
amazing. Yeah, I'll make sure to link to all of these things here in the show notes. I want to go over some real interesting stuff with you here. Speaking of biohacking, I want to go over that with you and talk about how we can improve the health of our brain and optimize our brain and performance at work. Since you kick things off here with your tools here, as someone who is very interested in biohacking, what got you into biohacking, as you were just mentioning how you're using your metabolic data to improve your brain health as well?
Yeah, I guess professionally, there's a jumping off point where I moved from the academic into the entrepreneurial world and started doing things in biohacking. That would probably be when I helped found True Brain with Chris Thompson, which is a nootropic company that produced a sort of nice entry point for folks. And then at this point, they have a nice product that is a liquid nootropic people enjoy for productivity boost, has caffeine and some other stuff in it. But those of us that are significant biohackers may have always been such, like little kids trying to figure out how things work, take things apart when we're growing up. The kind of person has to understand how things are constructed. In terms of the brain and a brain-focused biohacking, I spent a good solid 10, 11, 12 years working in inpatient psych and in acute developmental disability, residential facilities and things before grad school, and just saw huge amounts of human variability across different aspects of development, injury, suffering, everything from psychiatric to drug abuse to aging to childhood development stuff, just across the board, and was pretty impressed by the variability and was pretty nonplussed by how much change we were able to support for people. We weren't able to do very much, for instance, in autism centers or even in drug abuse center places, dual diagnosis, where they had a lot of anxiety and depression and drug abuse. They weren't very effective at doing a lot. So I saw a lot of human suffering and a lot of people at the edge of their resources, and edge of their stability, their resilience, their crises, et cetera. And I was working at a psychiatric hospital in Massachusetts, which was probably among the most violent places in the country that did inpatient block facility kind of stuff. And I was working there for about a year or two, and I got injured pretty significantly and could not do the work I'd been doing, which is a hands-on kind of role, and spent a couple of years instead working with more of a case management, working more on the younger and older populations there. And over that time, so because of the injuries, wasn't able to keep engaged in the same way. And this was a while ago, and there was a healthcare sort of contraction broadly in the economy. It was contracting anyways at that point. But the hospital I worked for went out of business. And I could not just take the experience I had and go lateral because I had been promoted above my degree ability, a mix of being injured and having good skills with children. I was doing case management work that I didn't have a degree for, essentially, unless I was supervised by somebody who had the right licensure. So couldn't just transfer my job to the next psych hospital or whatever, and ended up going into high tech and leaving human services for a few years and get back into that geekery and doing some data work and a bunch of like high level integration stuff. That was around when the tech bubble was correcting as well. And that combined with missing working for human services, I went and found a place that did autism work not too far from where I was living. And they did neurofeedback. I was looking for that particular technology as in this thing I'd heard about, this biofeedback on the brain stuff. And I walked in there hoping to get like an observational internship for a few months and walked out with a part-time job. And before I knew it, I was working there full time and learning all this stuff. And a couple of years later, I basically decided I had to go back to grad school because of all this stuff I was seeing. My prior experience told me that things like autism and ADHD and developmental challenges and seizures and migraines and major drug abuse and all that stuff was just non-tractable, at least with our tools that we had accessible for folks. But working here, I was seeing change. I was seeing a lot of change, a lot of improvements in things like attention resources and sensory integration and huge changes in seizures and migraines and brain fog and just global features of brain that I had been working with for a long time and seeing lots of suffering and not a lot of movement. And here I was seeing a lot of movement. So after working there for a couple of years, it forced me to go back to grad school and figure out what the heck was happening. Because at this stage of the game, in the field of neurofeedback, this was in the around 2000, 2001 or two or something, 20 years ago. The field was not new. It was at that point 30, 40 years old. It was discovered in the mid 60s or early 60s or even earlier, potentially based on what definition you use. But at that time, there was 3 or 4 different major schools of thought about what we were doing to the brain when we created this change, what the best way was to go after assessing a brain, making the change, et cetera. And the schools of thought were in pretty significant opposition. They were not reconcilable. And there was a lot of vitriol, people fighting in their little tiny niche area of the marketplace around mental health, really fighting with each other about how this stuff works and nasty diatribes on news groups and things back, this thing we used to have called news groups on the internet. And so after years of that, I was like, wait a minute, we have lion, men, and elephants here. People have a piece of it. No, people are describing it. They're sure they know the answer. No one has any clue what they're doing. And yet, all 3 or 4 of these schools of thought that all claim they have the right answer, they're all getting better results on brains than traditional mental health, psychiatry, medicine. What's going on? How can they're not right? They're not reconcilable. And yet they're all able to help ADHD or trauma or anxiety or sleep issues or seizures or whatever. What's going on here? So that put me on a path of trying to figure out the mechanisms of neurofeedback, how the brain can be pushed around essentially, or trained or encouraged to move using an outside stimulus, using loop, a computerized feedback loop. So in the case of, just to break down the operational, if you wanted to train the brain using biofeedback, you might train a resource or a circuit that was represented by a couple of different brain waves or little modules the brain can activate. There's a part of the brain, for instance, on the right-hand side that helps us know if we're paying attention. So it's a great one to go after for executive function, which scaffolds productivity because you're not being disinhibited or distracted. You can stay on task and know what is task appropriate and select your attention in the right direction and resist things that would distract you. Call that inhibitory tone, basically. So you aren't like squirrel, you can, move in one direction. That's really scaffolded by a part of the brain in the right motor cortex. And it does its job using beta waves, this mid-frequency beta wave called SMR, or sensory motor rhythm. If you've seen a cat in a windowsill, you've seen SMR. It's that like still body, but laser-like focus. Motorically or physically inhibited, but mentally very poised, very ready is the SMR, the sensory motor rhythm state. And cats do a lot of this. Humans do it moment to moment when we need to pump the brakes or stay asleep or not go squirrel or something. There's a bunch of things we use it for. So if you stuck a wire on that part of the head and then a couple ear clips to measure in comparison to, and measured the amount of that SMR wave, that beta wave, moment to moment, and the amount of theta, which is like a lubrication frequency, lets things happen. Measure it moment to moment. And whenever your brain happened to make a little more SMR, a little less theta, the computer would go, "Ooh, good job, brain," and make something happen. So a little car starts to move, or your puzzle pieces fill in, or your Pac-Man starts to eat some dots. The brain says, "Oh, hey, wait, stuff. Cool, I like stuff." And a few seconds later, it happens to move in the wrong direction. The theta goes back up and the SMR goes down, and the car slows down, and the Pac-Man stalls, or the puzzle pieces stop filling in. And the brain goes, "Hey, where's my stuff?" And a few seconds later, it happens to move in the right direction, and the applause resumes. So this is basically operant conditioning. We move the goalposts every few seconds. So we're encouraging a trend to be rewarded, not just an event. But you can't control your brain waves. You can't actually feel them pretty much. So you're like, "Why is this stupid animation, the screen stopping? This is boring." And we're like, "Okay, yeah, But after 2 or 3 sessions of it, your brain says, I was getting more information from the outside world when I dropped my theta and brought my beta up. I'm going to do that." And if you like decide to wash your dishes, you'll suddenly discover they're done. Or you ask your kid to take the trash out and they get up and do it. And you're like, "Whoa, that was weird." Because suddenly the mind is more organized and it can execute and move to the next task without the theta getting in the way. So you can go after these resources and you can create essentially a scaffolding for productivity. And from the context of this audience, the show, productivity is not so much about what is being done. Yes, having vision for it, having structure to get there, breaking things into tasks, all that classic stuff is really important. I look at productivity and wants to be productive. No one wants to be lazy. Laziness is not a thing by itself necessarily. There's always reasons for stuff getting in the way. Are you distractible? Is it anxiety? Are you poorly rested? Is there some like resistance because of the relationship that you have to the task because of who's assigned it? There's 1,000 reasons we can have crappy execution on something. And I look at most things in the brain, most things that I used to think about years ago, inpatient, et cetera, thinking in a psychiatric sense. Now I think about as resources. And you can see a lot of them when you look at a brain map, which is the tool we use for neurofeedback. And you can help people go after the resources. So if they're distractible, if they have ADHD or they're a squirrel all the time, can't stay on task, you can measure that in the brain. You can measure that in their performance. You can train that frequency up for a while. It might take 20, 30, 40 sessions. It might take 2, 3 months. But along that time, your feeling changes happen. You're getting executive function, sleep, stress changes. And generally in a 3-month course of neurofeedback, about 40 sessions, people will make about 2 standard deviations on a bell curve of executive function measurements and performance and on the corresponding brain activity. And then they also feel it. So there's a huge sort of convergence of all the data towards, whoa, things are different. And brain maps don't change on their own. So when you get a change of that magnitude and a performance change of that magnitude across a few months, seeing it go in a linear way, it's a pretty robust phenomena. So you can think of the whole field of neurofeedback like this personal training thing. But to give you a long-winded answer, I got very excited by seeing people being able to take control of stuff. So I had to dig in and decompose and unpack the field a little bit and create a different version of it.
Yeah, I love it. I want to unpack some things that you said there. So I spend about maybe 10, 15 hours a week talking to customers, clients, people that we work with, just to get an idea of what people are dealing with. And some of the things I've heard over the years that's I think has been an interesting trend is stuff like I have brain fog, or I can't focus, or I can't concentrate, or I'm now diagnosed with ADHD, which is something that maybe 10, 15 years ago was not that common. What is your take on all of these things? Is that like a real thing that's happening to people's brains? What's causing it? What's the trend you're seeing there?
Yeah, people are definitely experiencing increased performance difficulties these days. I think, especially with the pandemic, there's an awful lot of increased stress, dysregulation of sleep and other habits. Whether things are actual diagnostic labels and whether there's more ADHD or more autism or more whatever around these days, that's an open question. That's a bit of a nuanced discussion. What I would say is it doesn't matter a whole lot what you call stuff. What matters is what you're experiencing and what you want to experience. So you don't have to approach the brain. And that's really why I use tools like brain mapping, is I don't approach the brain from a diagnostic perspective oh, here's what's wrong with you. I'll be like, hey, here's how different you are than the average person your age. And in your performance, here's some opportunities. Are these things you care about? Okay, great. Let's go after them. When it comes to your brain, it's more like, hey, here's how weird you are. People are weird. Good job. Be weird. But now let's walk through all the things, all the ways in which you're most unusual, the resources, the circuits. Let's figure out if some of these things are actually in the way. If they are, okay, let's change it. It's not hard to change your brain, believe it or not. It's only hard to understand brains. So if someone comes in with I would say every month, I probably see about 30 or 40 people who come in with ADHD diagnoses for their first brain map. Let's just say I get one person a day, just on average, who is, I have an ADHD diagnosis. Someone just gave it to me. My kid just got it. I've had it for 10 years, whatever. Half the time, maybe more, when you look at the brain, you don't see ADHD. Anxiety, you might see trauma. You often see a mix of crappy sleep, speed of processing issues, and stress response stuff all fighting. So what you're getting is a brittle reactive person being labeled as hyperactive because they're a sports car driving with the e-brake engaged and their foot on the floor, and every little thing they have to dodge around makes them scoot across the highway all at once because they're running at one speed, grinding through fatigue. You see a lot of that. And ADHD itself, which is actually a poor management of that SMR frequency I mentioned earlier, that calm cat, like literally a calm cat in a windowsill, like literally is exhibiting the opposite of ADHD. ADHD is a high, good beta tone and and pumping the brakes on theta, resisting theta, suppressing it when you want to. That's what cats are doing in that mode. And humans who have ADHD and can't sit still, that motorically disinhibited state, that's a high theta state usually, and SMR is weak relative to it. We also call SMR sleep spindles in humans. It's the thing that fires to keep you asleep when you hear a car go by. Don't need to wake up. So ADHD almost always comes along with a sleep problem. So you tend to get a mix of these features of executive function, sleep regulation, stress response, both because of life being difficult and because of compensatory strategies, because you're pushing your brain through fatigue, and because you're gifted and a little on edge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So very rapidly, the labeling of a problem starts to drop away from being meaningful unless you're trying to treat it a certain way. But I'm trying to give people an understanding of their brain by showing them performance, by showing them physiology, and then modeling what's going on with them, and then agency to go after it and iteratively change. So typically I'm taking the label, if they have one, dropping below it to find the mechanisms and resources they care about, ways to measure them, ways to understand how they operate for them. People generally prioritize what they want to change at that point. And I build neurofeedback plans mostly and other life hacks, biohacking stuff to create change, and then rinse and repeat. So it's personal training as a metaphor is the stuff we do basically, but brains are weirder than bodies, a lot weirder. So a lot more different across people. So it's a lot more of a mysterious space, and trying to mostly get out of that landscape of we have to go to the expert to get the right answer. And that's what a diagnosis is. If you go to your psychologist, psychiatrist, whatever, and get a diagnosis, or any doctor for any problem or difficulty or symptom or goal you have, and you get a diagnosis or a prescription, part and parcel of that relationship is the assumption that there's value in them being right, accurate. They have the right med, the right diagnosis, they have the right answer for you. So if you want answers, you go see doctors. If you want questions, come see scientists. We are here to unpack stuff. So personal trainers in the gym, same thing. Look over your bone density scan and your strength assessment, and maybe look at your goals and try to find ways to build resources to get you to your goals. In the case of the brain, sometimes goals are suffering driven, a lot more perhaps. Maybe PT is a suffering, or OT in the gym is a suffering focused or alleviation version, but you can also do peak performance stuff in the gym, just like you can do for the brain. So anyways.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I know one thing that a lot of people do here in Austin. Austin's a hub of health and wellness, and I'm surrounded by people all the time who are interested in improving their health and wellness. And one of the things that people do here is they do a brain scan where they measure the different brain waves, and then they can see if it's like overheated or it's stressed out or if it's inflamed. Can you describe to a person what that process is like and why people do it and how it's useful?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to do this, and some are better than others, honestly. And in the space of biohacking, just to as an aside, there's a certain amount of bunkery, quackery, nonsense, and snake oil. And some of the assessment tools out there, especially if they have the word brain attached to them, can become such rapidly. So I would encourage folks to make sure things pass a sniff test. Make sure the people you're working with can explain what they're doing, be legitimate, that kind of stuff. And one big flag, if the word quantum is attached to something, just walk away. Generally, there are some things in the neurofeedback world that are not really neurofeedback, that are like farcical devices. They're versions of what's called the Rife machine and quantum biofeedback and stuff like that. Just horrible, predatory practitioners and very expensive, and they do absolutely nothing. Basically, word to the wise, unless you're in a physics lab, the word quantum means someone's trying to take your money. Basically, it's a big red flag. But the more legit version of brain mapping or assessments is called quantitative EEG or QEEG. There's many ways you can do a brain scan. Dr. Amen, the Amen Centers, does SPECT scanning, which is near infrared spectroscopy. It's also quite interesting, quite useful for some reasons. You can do MRIs, you can do X-rays, you can do a three-dimensional X-rays we call CT scans, essentially. They look at slices. It's all kinds. You do PET scans and positron emission tomography, where you tag oxygen or glucose with radioactivity and measure stuff. There's all different reasons you might measure, and different types of neuroimaging are good at picking up different things, different difficulties, different types of tissue, et cetera. What we use at Peak Brain and what we mostly use in the field of neurofeedback for imaging is something called EEG, or electricity. And it's a passive way of measuring. You don't have to get into the brain at all. So in the case of doing a brain map, we'll put a cap on your head and squirt it full of gel at about 20 different points and measure the electricity your brain is making moment to moment. So we always do two things. We always first do an attention test that is ridiculously boring. You'll hate me just a little bit sometimes after the attention test is done, to bore you to tears for 20 minutes and have you click on the mouse for some things that pop up and resist other things and see how you fall over in your performance. So a little 25-minute bore you to tears attention test. And then we put a cap on your head, squirt it full of gel, have you sit still for about 10 minutes, eyes closed, and 10 minutes, eyes open. And that's the assessment, the physiology measurements and the one performance measurement. Those things are then compared to a normative database that is age matched and heavily cleaned to be somewhat arbitrarily average. And you look for things that stick up against that on a bell curve. And in the performance, you end up with about 14 or 15 different features. So not just ADHD, but inattention, impulsivity, auditory versus visual, short, little transient errors versus long-term trends, reaction times, error proneness, repetitiveness, all kinds of stuff gets teased apart. So much more granular than anything you would call ADHD. And in fact, if you have ADHD, you'll trip the flag on this test that says you have difficulty with your attention, but you'll also trip it with lots of mold exposure or COVID brain fog or concussion or major anxiety and sleep issues, making it so you can't focus and worry about stuff that's happening whenever you get distracted. So you don't know why someone has executive function issues, and the labeling as such historically in the manual as used by psychologists is a symptom-driven label, not a mechanism or a physiology-driven label. And yet you can look at the physiology for classic phenomena like ADHD and spot what's going on in classic populations of ADHD. Like in kids with ADHD, you can see it by looking at the brain. It's really obvious. EEG mapping, or QEEG, grabs a baseline from you and then does a population level analysis of these averages, these amounts, distribution, connectivity patterns, speeds, et cetera, of brainwaves, and then does a sort of, it's called a phenotype exploration. You look at the different unusual features. People are weird. And so you can see the big rich clubs, the rich hubs of the cortex. The top of the brain is called the cortex, the bark. And it's mostly where a lot of the thinking happens. A lot of the information processing that we're aware of happens is in the top of the brain. Huge sheet of tissue that's all folded up and squished into the top of the brain. And there's big networks within the cortex that connect parts of the cortex and other parts of the brain that are essentially major networks. And they're called the rich clubs or rich hubs. And they include things that are people are often aware of these days, called the default mode network, which is like your awareness of the self, what you're thinking about in the outside world, or the salience network, what's important to pay attention to, the executive function network, controlling your attention in real time and selecting from among competing different things you might want to do in the moment. Like you step out into traffic, across the street for a stop, a walk sign flashes. At the same time, a car comes around the corner. It's an executive conflict, and to select from two different things, for instance, versus salience. Now you should pay attention to the car, versus default mode network, playing the song in your head and replaying the argument with your friend. At the same time, you're having some shame about it. At the same time, you're remembering that you might want to evaluate the environment around you for safety. So you can see these networks to some extent, these big giant clubs. You can also see the frontal lobe areas. You can see some association and sensory areas. You don't always know what they mean, but I can look at your brain and go, ooh, you're unusual. Hey, this part of the brain might be this. So those clubs, those rich hubs, those big networks are somewhat representative across people. For example, a lot of the high performers, and I bet this show has people who fit this category, a lot of high performers have a touch of anxiety. There's a certain flavor of brilliance that produces both the CEO and the guy with OCD or features of it. The mind, when you have subacute or non-problematic versions of OCD, then you perseverate. You have songs in your head, you bite your nails, you're a little particular, a little obsessive. When that cramps up into super high gear, it becomes actual features of OCD or Tourette's or tics. They're all the same circuit. There's a circuit in the front midline of the head called the anterior cingulate. And its job is to switch your focus around and help you remember what you're thinking about. So if it's doing its job, you walk into the store and go, yeah, I'm here for eggs. Grab the eggs. Didn't forget your wallet because you were thinking about it. Like you operate in terms of focusing on what you have to focus on, then you move on. If the anterior cingulate gets stuck in beta waves and can't produce alpha, a neutral frequency, then it selects the same thing to think about it again and again. And that's the experience of OCD's perseverative or stuck thoughts. Or maybe if it's high amounts of theta there, you can't stop behavior from doing the same thing again and again. And now you find yourself biting your nails every 2 seconds. Or picking at thread or something. Not a pathological thing per se. It's the same circuit that gets cramped up. We all have one. And we have one in the back middle. These are parts of the default mode network, the cingulates, but we have one in the back middle called the posterior cingulate, whose job it is to watch the world around you. So if I saw your posterior was hot, I might be like, oh, my friend, your posterior cingulate's kind of making a lot of beta. That might mean your brain's kind of caught in this, watch the road kind of evaluation mode. And we call that rumination, where you have learned the world is not especially safe or predictable, and your brain's always looking for the possibility of danger. So I wouldn't know if that was true for you, but I would know it's plausible for you. And if you're like, oh yeah, I experienced some activation, I have some trouble activated, can't stop worrying. Oh, that's unfortunate. Let's go after it. Let's exercise that beta down, bring the alpha up, and give you an actual experience of going, I'm going to put down that threat sensitivity right now. I'd rather not worry right now, and have a voluntary control over putting down intrusive worried thoughts, for instance, for the cingulates, or behind the right ear, the sensory world coming in, or 1,000 other things you could decide to tune because they were important to you.
So how would the process look like if you wanted to, let's say, rewire your brain in that sense? Is it a combination of sleeping more, eating differently, doing brain exercises? I think everyone has heard that if you want to keep your brain healthy, do Sudoku puzzles or something every day, right? Like, how does that process actually work in terms of if you do a scan, you go, okay, these things are off. Like, how do we retrain this?
Yeah, for me, for peak brain, neurofeedback is the heavy lifter and will make rapid and dramatic change in a lot of things. But there's an awful lot of stuff you can and probably should do that isn't neurofeedback to optimize brain health and to encourage more rapid transformation when you're trying to make some. To that end, we do a fair amount of coaching with clients around aspects of sleep, especially because sleep regulation and the circadian cues that throw off sleep regulation, which we're often pretty bad at screening out, so to speak, in the Western world. Those cues will really support lots of me. So I'm a big fan basically of circadian support from a basic life support. You should be sleeping, but also at the right time with right cues, just like nutrition stuff, just like exercise stuff, exercise, as well as meditation. We encourage a lot of meditation and mindfulness practices. For all of these things, what we do is we meet every individual client where they are and talk about the big points of suffering and stuff that might make sense to try in terms of the different interventions that are outside the scope of neurofeedback, perhaps. Also, clients generally have things they are interested in manipulating. They're interested in going certain ways with diet or body training or fasting or meditation or certain nootropics or supplements or hacking their B vitamins off their methylation status, or they're really into hyperbaric medicine, or they're really into saunas and ice baths, or they're really into red light therapy or whatever. So I'm not going to tell like a lifelong vegan that they have to go carnivore when they ask them what to do nutritionally. If they're trying to do pro health, anti-aging, anti-brain injury stuff, I might have them do narrow feeding windows and try to drop some of the calories. They can generate ketones. But somebody who's got a different lifestyle set of tools they want to work with, there are no gurus in this space. It's personal training. This is why I use things like the BioSense for my acetone, is because I don't want to listen to what the keto gurus say. I did that for decades, reading this book and that book and going, wait, how many carbs can I have? Oh my God, I had 1 more gram of carb. I must be out of ketosis. No, just teach your body, learn your body, and manage your body. It's like learning to drive the car with all the buttons and all the levers and get all the extra power mode when you can. This morning I woke up and I had acetone levels of 5, which is equivalent to blood levels of butyrate of 5 millimoles. That's decent ketosis. And I had a pint of ice cream at 7:30 last night for dessert, after having a sandwich that included sourdough bread for dinner. I had carbs. Like I had a significant amount of carbs yesterday, and a pound of red cherries actually yesterday. I had a higher protein earlier meal, but I had a lot of carbs, a couple hundred grams of carb yesterday, and I woke up in ketosis. And I'll be in deeper ketosis later on today, and even deeper tomorrow, because tomorrow I'm doing basically no carb. But you learn to manipulate these things, not listen to keto gurus who would never believe you can have 200 grams of carbs and be in ketosis the next morning, because you generally can't unless you are able to maintain the edge of flexibility. Normally, if you eat carbs routinely, you get blunted to that effect and you just stay in ketone generation and eventually high insulin, high blood sugar. That way lies metabolic ruin, aging, death, all kinds of stuff. Definitely drops in performance, but you can hack that system, you can learn the tools. And so when someone comes to me and is like, oh, I'm really I got to hit the stage for a bodybuilding show, or I got to hit a fastball. I can't react fast enough to anything over 80 miles an hour. Or, God, I'm freezing up trying to give my red carpet speeches now. When the paparazzi is in front of me, I'm having anxiety attacks. Or, my kid's having too many seizures now. The seizures went way up after they got COVID. What's happening? Or my nonverbal kid is stimming again. Oh my gosh, what can we help them? The answer is always, let's get in there and look at it and iterate and find tools. And every person's needs are so different. Most neurofeedback practices and most biohacking wellness centers tend to focus on narrow populations. I know a lot of your constituents in Austin who have wellness practices. An awful lot of my friends have moved from LA to Austin and have centers that have fitness and red light and kettlebells and all kinds of awesome biohacks. And every individual that comes in there ideally does an individualized approach. And there's really no difference when it comes to brain training. But for me, the high level is map the brain and then do neurofeedback roughly half an hour 3 times a week. Map the brain again every other month, and you can see changes. And then we have them report every day what they're noticing, twice a day in surveys and tracking. And there's a whole dashboard we created for clients to help. Basically, we're helping them biohack. It's like a personal trainer log they're keeping track of. But for each client, there may be additional stuff. For someone, it's not drinking is the big deal. For someone else, it's reducing seizures. Someone else, it's moving out of executive mode and into receptive attention mode when they're at home, so their wife doesn't think there's much of a jerk anymore because they're just being a jerk when they get home, and keep being the boss or whatever. It's 1,000 goals. So I would say that there's a lot we can do. Sleep is almost always something we should be managing for circadian reasons and general brain health reasons. Metabolic biohacking stuff is almost always something to think about, maybe acutely in the short term for brain injuries or performance or post-COVID brain, maybe in the long term for anti-aging, because all the diseases of aging are metabolic diseases, essentially. Most forms of dementia, most forms of cancer, diabetes, et cetera, are metabolically kerosene tossed on a fire, causing the systems to fall over. They're not really truly infectious or disease processes that you fight against the same way as you do other external things. It's the system falling over and its regulatory stability. And just like you can take someone who's, now we know, someone who's type 2 diabetic and fast them, put them on high protein, and get people with no insulin to start regenerating beta islet cells in the pancreas and producing micro amounts of insulin. You can do some of the same stuff with someone who's got a brain that's really thrown off. And the brain is more flexible. The brain's weirder than bodies, but it's also way more flexible than bodies. Think about how much change you can get in the gym in 3 months with a trainer. You can do more with regards to transforming your brain generally.
So if there's a way to zoom out, what would you say are some best practices if people want to improve their overall brain health? Because I get that everyone is going to be different, obviously, right?
Sure.
But are there like maybe 3, 4, 5 things you would recommend that everyone should be doing?
Yeah, I have a handful of things I like to recommend that are a mix of a circadian hacks will basically reinforce the signaling in a couple of different ways. Now, there's many things, many exogenous or outside world cues that the brain uses for timing, for knowing what time of day it is. And it integrates those things and tends to create a pulse within the brain that then cascades down and resets a bunch of clocks that aren't really running alongside each other in any time locked way. And the better you are at getting into good circadian entrainment in some ways, the better you are at a lot of things. The most efficient sleep, the most efficient stress, the most efficient body comp, all kinds of stuff. So I focus on a bunch of activities adjunctively to neurofeedback that will often give people enough of the tools they need to get that stability back in play for the circadian systems. And they include the big 3 are don't eat before bed. That's the biggest one, actually, because the circadian system, the biggest exogenous cue is not light. It's when you eat, not light at all. Light's a very weak circadian entrainer, and evening light and stuff is just not that interesting in terms of color, and blue blocking glasses, I think, are mostly nonsense. Bright lights in the evening do something, but evening light is not a big deal for circadian. So eating, huge cue for the body. So don't eat for a few hours before bed. Second rule, get up early. The time to sleep in is at the beginning of the night, not the end of the night. So morning rise time is way more important for circadian support and for sleep regulation than when you go to bed. Third rule, before you eat in the morning, get up and do something, move for 15, 20 minutes. Low intensity exercise. Don't go weightlifting. Don't go hit your kettlebells first thing in the morning. Don't drive up cortisol. Don't drive up glycogen with hardcore exercise or steady state exercise, because that's what woke you up. Circadian signals release cortisol. Cortisol squeezes your liver. The liver feeds you breakfast. So suddenly cortisol and glycogen are high. You're wide awake. You got a good hour or 2 of energy to burn off. Do some yoga, go for a walk, bring your partner a cup of coffee from the place a block away. Burn off some energy. Don't move from the bed to the couch or the bed to the desk or the breakfast table and start taking in energy. Work on the energy flux, cause a signal. So in order of importance, fast before bed, get up early and move. And when I say early, I mean within 1 hour of sunrise. There is a light cue that matters. The only light cue that's very strong, there's a nucleus behind the optic crossing of the optic nerve called the optic chiasm. There's a nuclei just above it called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN. And mostly what it does is it watches the retina and it helps understand the color of light coming in. But it's really only tripped by the color of light in the first 1 hour. When the sun's higher in the sky, the temperature, the color of the light changes, and too much of that color is reflected back out into the void of space. And it's very weak entrainment for light after that. So fast before bed, get up early, go outside, get a walk, get some morning light, get that little energy flux going when you're first moving. Then, bonus tip, move your hardcore stuff to the afternoon, your resistance training, your kettlebells, your whatever, to the afternoon or early evening, because your cortisol is at its lowest in a circadian sense, and your cardiac output is at its highest in a true sense. So then every pump will be big and strong and move a lot of blood. And if you do jack up cortisol briefly because you hit the weight super hard and raw, you feel it, it mobilizes a little fat, it burns off and goes down again. It doesn't cause cortisol resistance or insulin resistance or glycogen resistance essentially in the morning because you worked out too hard first thing. So those are the metabolic biohacking tricks that I like. And then within that, I often layer in, depending on the person, this has to be individualized, but fasting is a super useful tool as well. Because with nutrition or energy, because some of these circadian rules, as I'm describing, are energy flux management rules. But you can think about energy in terms of food, and you can partition or manipulate the macronutrients, the amounts, or the timing. And those 3 things create different signals, and we'll play with leptin, insulin, mTOR, et cetera. So I often help people figure out a more circadian appropriate, biohacking appropriate, aging appropriate strategy for their goals with regards to those 3 features of time, caloric restriction, or macronutrient partitioning, because those will also create secondary effects that feed back into the regulation.
The last thing I want to ask you about is your wearables. So wearables
Mm,
are becoming a hot thing. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Oura Ring myself. I've had one for
yep.
the last 2.5 years. Probably going to upgrade to version 3 at some point because I like it that much.
Yeah, that's what I
And
have. I have the 3. It's all right. I
yeah,
don't see any, I've graded, but I don't notice any difference. I don't think there's any urgency to upgrade, FYI.
yeah, I hope the
And the
software updates
pricing's
at
not
some
quite as
point.
good. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So speaking of wearables, I saw you earlier mentioned, I believe the BioSense. Is that what it
Yeah,
was?
the BioSense we use, Peak Brain has a coupon, Peak Brain 20, I think, for that. But this is a breath meter for acetone. I use an Oura Ring. The EEG devices we use for home training and for office training are basically wearables as well. So we have, little wires you can stick on. We've also got infrared headbands you can use. This is another small EEG. Wearable is a bit of an exaggeration, but you clip it to yourself and then put 3 wires on and do your brain training. A lot of consumer wearables in the brain space are nonsense. It's really hard to spend a couple $100 and not lose your money on something that's just bunk, honestly. So don't get into the small wearables that are for your head that purport to do something. Even the sleep trackers, and I do love my Oura Ring, even the sleep trackers are very imperfect and do not do a lot of what you would think they do. I wore 4 arms full on both sides of sleep trackers for several months, a couple of years ago, of all the sleep trackers, just to get a sense. Because all my clients were like, oh, my sleep tracker says this, and this says this, and this says this. And I didn't know what to make of all the different things people were telling me. So I had to get a first person perspective on what they said for a while. But with sleep trackers, the most important thing for you and for everyone, probably look at the deep sleep numbers, which are decent because HRV is a decent measure for that, and total sleep. Completely ignore, pretend it's a made up number, the measurement of REM. It is not a real number on most of these sleep trackers. It is completely invalid. Perhaps more meaningfully, REM doesn't flex day to day, really, not the same way that other things do, like total amounts of sleep or deep sleep. So if your REM is shorted significantly or it's disrupted significantly for a few days or weeks, you rapidly lose your mind. Like you literally become psychotic and dysregulated and develop a thought disorder. If you got issues with the REM, you got bigger problems. The REM is not the thing you care about. And so don't worry about it. Deep sleep will flex based on stress, amount of sleep, amount of energy, when you eat, exercise, all kinds of stuff. It will definitely flex in response tonight to that. So look at your deep sleep and husband that sucker. Get it to be 20-25% of your total sleep. Get enough sleep, and then play with those circadian rhythms. And those things will often give many people a nice floor to then build some pretty good performance gains on top of.
Are there any other things you look at when you look at your Oura Ring? And does it shape somehow your day in some shape or
No, I
form?
just look at deep sleep. I just look at total sleep. That's it. It is just not, and the Aura is the best of all the options. The Aura and the Whoop, I think, are probably the top ones. And I recommend the Whoop when folks are serious athletes for the coaching ability and the broader data sets. But the newer one, especially, there's very little you aren't getting on the new Auras, with body temperature and some other metrics in there. They have some SpO2 stuff even that they're trying to implement now. But I don't think that the do everything devices are do everything. I think that heart rate variability is a decent measure for deep sleep. And unless you're going to measure, the only way to get better measurements of sleep staging is you need multiple things. You need this kind of stuff, heart rate variability. You also need actigraphy, actually movements, like the BioSense guys who do really interesting sets of sleep trackers. Their main kit has a wrist strap, but also an ankle tab. So you can do actigraphy or movement and get an extra limb involved and get much better measurements of a light versus deep sleep. Really elegant to offer that in a consumer product. Big fans of the guys at BioStrap. Big fans. Even though I'm not quite as trusting right now of the newest, I haven't tested the quality of the newest tracker they have. But it's like a body fat scale in your gym, your bathroom. Yeah, it's got a number on it. And you want the number to move in a certain direction. You're happy when it does. And it means something. But the absolute number doesn't really mean much. And the fluctuating number a little bit day to day doesn't all, it might just be how much water you had that day and, or have you dehydrated a little bit more that day. So I wouldn't be too attached to thinking of the wearables as being the quantified self wearables aren't that accurate. And I also don't think that for many of us, I don't think you need to measure blood-based blood sugar. I think measuring insulin levels might be better, but that's a hard thing to do. And you can't do it with wearables. Unless you have significant blood sugar issues, I don't think you need to wear a blood sugar wearable or even do finger sticks. And if you can produce ketones in the breath, then you don't have high insulin or high blood sugar. So I like to find a flag or a metric that I know that I can operate within some sense of range. And if I happen to go on one side of it and things get tripped, oh, I crushed my ketones a few mornings in a row. Oh, I guess I better back off the carbs. Instead of going, oh my God, my keto guru said if I have more than 65 grams of carbs, I'll never hit ketosis again. Don't be attached to that. There are no gurus. There are no people that are absolutely right for you. So you got to learn the system. And that's why I like these sorts of tools. Just like the Oura Ring, deep sleep's a metric that I keep track of. And I know, like, I can quantify or I can gauge my good and bad habits a bit. I haven't been sleeping as much the past week as I want to. My Oura Ring gave me 4 hours and 20 minutes of sleep last night, but I got almost 100 minutes or something of deep sleep anyways. So I'm feeling fine today. And had I got 8 hours of sleep and no deep sleep, I'd be horrible. It's predictive. I often use sleep trackers, often with adolescents. I have their parents use them and have them do psychoeducational stuff, gamify it, reward them for good sleep numbers, and draw their attention gently to the fact they might be a jerk tonight because they have no deep sleep in their sleep tracker when they first wake up, et cetera, and gamify the sense of control over it. Anyways, a big fan of sleep tracking and hacking, as well as the macro hacking stuff. Yeah, there's really two pieces that have to be added into the brain performance piece.
Yeah, that's amazing. Dr. Hill, thank you so much for all this information and the simplicity of things people can do. I think that's always so important. And if people want to find out more about you, working with you, your company, any resources that you have, like, where should people go?
Sure. We'll definitely give you guys a discount for brain mapping at our local centers. We have offices in New York City, St. Louis, LA, Orange County, and a couple overseas. But we also work with clients all over the world without ever visiting offices. So just come to one of our websites or socials and hit us up. It's at Peak Brain Institute is the website.com. And then the socials are all Peak Brain LA. My own personal social, Andrew Hill, PhD, is mostly full of baked goods. So if you want to see baked goods, that's where you go. But yeah, if you'd like to do some work with your brain and the technical stuff, we certainly coach on the more lifestyle factors. We have mindfulness groups every week we offer. Mostly we do neurofeedback. So if you're near an office, you have a nice discount club fee through the show that you can get you unlimited brain maps. If you're not near an office, you still have a discount, and you can let us know how we can support your brain health and goals. And we'll talk to each individual about that as we need to.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Nice to meet you face to face and to be back on the show in its later iteration. It's great.